The combine sat alone at the far end of Mason Pike's salvage yard. Its unloading auger rested on the ground, like a broken arm. The windshield had shattered years ago, allowing birds to nest inside the cab. Rust covered almost every exposed surface, while weeds had grown through the header until the machine seemed rooted to the earth. People walking through the auction barely glanced at it. To them, it was already dead. Arthur Reed stopped. At 71, Arthur no longer owned the repair shop that had once made him the best mechanic in 3 counties. Cheap replacement parts, computerized diagnostics, and rising debt had forced him to close the business nearly a decade earlier. Now he repaired old tractors in a small barn behind his house whenever neighbors asked for help. Most younger farmers preferred dealerships. Old mechanics, they said, belonged to another generation. Arthur ignored the voices around him and walked slowly around the combine. The engine was seized. The feeder chain had rusted solid. One rear axle seal had leaked until dirt formed a thick black crust beneath it. Everything pointed toward a machine that had reached the end of its life. Everything except one detail. He crouched beside the left side panel. The gearbox mounted beneath the threshing chamber looked wrong. Not broken. Wrong. The casting had no company logo. Its edges were sharper than factory parts from that era. 4 mounting bolts matched the original hardware. The other 2 had drilled heads secured with twisted stainless safety wire. Arthur touched the wire with one finger. Safety wire wasn't used on ordinary farm repairs. It belonged on aircraft engines, racing transmissions, and experimental machinery where engineers needed proof that bolts hadn't loosened during testing. Someone had installed this gearbox for observation, not convenience. You planning to fix it? Arthur looked up. Mason Pike stood nearby holding a clipboard. The salvage yard belonged to him. Everything that entered eventually left as recycled steel. Arthur nodded toward the gearbox. Who owned this combine? Old Benson Farm. What happened to it? Broke down. What broke? Mason shrugged. Everything. Arthur wasn't satisfied. Did anyone open this gearbox? Mason laughed. Why would they? The engine's locked. Nobody spends money chasing ghosts. He slapped the side of the combine. I'm selling 10 tons of scrap. Arthur didn't answer. He brushed dirt away from the gearbox housing. Just above one mounting ear, beneath decades of grease, he noticed 3 tiny punch marks arranged in a triangle. Factory inspection marks. But they weren't placed where manufacturers normally stamped quality checks. These looked deliberate, private. The auction began. Usable equipment sold quickly. Tractors, ballers, cultivators, trailers. By late afternoon, only broken machinery remained. The combine rolled onto the auction list last. The auctioneer looked almost embarrassed. Non-running combine. Engine seized. Selling as is. He opened at $200. Silence. 100. Nothing. 50. Still nothing. Mason folded his arms. I'll give 20. The crowd chuckled. Someone shouted, You'll lose money hauling it. Another added, Leave it here. It'll rust into the ground. The auctioneer sighed. $40? Arthur raised his hand. I'll take it. Every head turned. A young farmer laughed loudly. Arthur finally found a retirement project. Another smiled. Or a graveyard. Mason stared at him. You serious? Arthur nodded. The gavel fell. Sold. While everyone walked away toward the parking lot, Mason followed Arthur to the combine. You know transport will cost more than the machine. I know. You'll never harvest another acre with it. I know. Then why buy it? Arthur looked once more at the strange gearbox. Because someone spent a lot of time building something they never intended ordinary farmers to notice. Mason laughed. It's a homemade repair. Arthur slowly shook his head. No. How can you tell? He pointed at the safety wire. The man who installed this expected someone to inspect it. Mason looked confused. Arthur smiled faintly. Farmers repair machines to finish harvest. He rested his hand on the unusual gearbox. Engineers repair machines to answer questions. As the evening sun struck the side of the housing, a small patch of grease softened under the heat. Arthur wiped it away with his thumb. Beneath it, almost invisible, was a tiny hand-stamped marking. Not a serial number, not a model designation, just 3 characters. Toll. Arthur covered the mark before anyone else noticed. He didn't know what R12 meant, but after 50 years repairing farm machinery, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. Factory combines weren't marked that way. Someone had built this machine for a purpose no sales brochure had ever mentioned. The combine reached Arthur's barn 2 days later on a lowboy trailer. Moving it cost 6 times more than buying it. Caleb Reed watched from the driveway as the driver lowered the ramps and attached a winch cable to the front axle. "You paid for this?" Arthur stood beside him with both hands in his coat pockets. $40. I mean the transport. Arthur did not answer. The winch pulled the combine backward. Its locked wheels scraped across the trailer deck, leaving long, rust-colored marks. When the machine finally reached the barn floor, the driver unhooked the cable and shook his head. "Most people pay me to haul these away." Arthur signed the receipt. After the truck left, Caleb walked around the combine. He was 24 and worked installing electrical control systems in grain facilities. He understood sensors, software, and automated motors. Old machinery interested him only when it could be connected to a laptop. He kicked one of the cracked tires. "What are you planning to do with it?" "Inspect it." "Then?" "That depends on what it is." Caleb looked at the faded green body. "It's a broken combine." Arthur opened the left service panel. "No. It's a combine with broken parts." He pointed toward the gearbox he had noticed at the auction. "There's a difference." Before removing anything, Arthur cleaned the surrounding area with brushes and compressed air. He photographed every bolt, bracket, and weld. Then he wrote the machine's visible details in an old repair ledger. Caleb watched for several minutes. "You usually tear things apart faster than this." "I'm not repairing it yet." "What are you doing?" "Making sure I don't destroy the answer." The gearbox had been mounted to an original support frame, but 2 additional braces had been welded between the housing and the separator body. The welds were narrow and even, not field work. A farmer rushing through harvest would have used whatever steel was available and welded only enough to hold the part in place. These braces had been measured, shaped, and fitted before installation. Arthur removed a layer of grease from the gearbox cover. There was no cast manufacturer name, no part number, only the R12 stamp. Caleb photographed it with his phone. Arthur then examined the safety wire. Each pair of bolts had been wired in opposite directions, so loosening one bolt would tighten the wire against the other. "That's aviation-style locking," Caleb said. Arthur nodded. "And testing work." They moved higher along the machine. Inside the threshing chamber, the rotor assembly carried several unusual features. Standard production rotors from that period used fixed mounting points. This one had slotted brackets. Arthur measured the slots. Each allowed nearly 3 inches of adjustment. Beside them were thin engraved lines, numbered 1 through 8. Caleb leaned into the opening. Could that be for alignment? Too many positions. Then speed control? Not directly. Arthur traced one line with a flashlight. The metal surrounding positions 3, 5, and 7 showed heavier tool marks. The rotor had been repeatedly moved between those settings. Someone had been testing different configurations. At the rear of the machine, they found another modification. 3 small brackets had been welded beneath the cleaning shoe. Each bracket contained a quick-release pin and a polished wear mark. Something removable had once hung there. Arthur crouched beneath the frame. Sampling trays. Caleb looked doubtful. "For what?" "To catch material leaving the machine." "You mean grain loss?" Arthur nodded. Engineers could weigh the contents of each tray after a test run and calculate how much grain escaped through different sections of the combine. The brackets were not useful during normal harvesting. They existed only for measurement. Caleb's expression changed. He no longer looked amused. Inside the cab, the original instrument panel was badly damaged. Most gauges were cloudy, and several wires had been cut, but beneath the seat, Arthur discovered a second wiring bundle wrapped in fabric tape. It led toward a narrow steel box mounted behind the operator's right shoulder. The box had no label. Its face contained 6 empty holes where switches or gauges had once been installed. The mounting screws were marked with red paint. Caleb touched one of the wires. "This wasn't added by a farmer." "No." "Could it have been a dealer modification?" Dealers label their work. Arthur opened the lower panel. Behind it were handwritten wire numbers and small metal tags stamped with abbreviations. RF, CL, SEP, LOS. Caleb read the last one aloud. LOS. Arthur looked toward the sampling brackets beneath the machine. The control box, adjustable rotor, and collection trays were part of the same system. The combine had been built to change internal settings while measuring the results. Caleb stepped back. So what was R12? Arthur closed the panel carefully. I don't know yet. He looked across the machine, no longer seeing rusted parts as separate failures. Every unusual feature pointed toward the same conclusion. This combine had not been modified to finish a harvest. It had been modified to study one. Arthur turned toward the dark opening of the threshing chamber. Someone used this machine as a moving laboratory, and somewhere inside it, he suspected, they had left a record of what they discovered. Arthur began the next morning by making one rule. Nothing would be removed until it had been photographed, measured, and marked. Caleb set up 2 work lights beside the combine, while Arthur placed numbered tags on the gearbox, rotor brackets, control box, and rear sampling mounts. The barn looked less like a repair shop now. It looked like an investigation. Arthur started with the adjustable rotor assembly. He cleaned only a narrow section of metal at a time, careful not to erase paint marks or scratches. Beneath the grease, the engraved position lines became clearer. There were 8 settings, but the wear was not equal. Positions 3, 5, and 7 showed repeated contact. The adjustment bolts had been tightened there so many times that the steel edges were slightly rounded. Caleb held a camera close. So they kept returning to those 3 settings. Yes, because those worked best, or because they failed differently. Arthur measured the angle of each position and entered the numbers in his ledger. The rotor blades were also unusual. Instead of being welded permanently, several were mounted on slotted plates. Their angle could be changed by loosening 2 bolts. Production combines were not built that way. Too many adjustable parts meant higher cost, more maintenance, and more chances for a farmer to set something incorrectly. But for engineers, adjustability meant data. Arthur inspected the blades closely. Small numbers had been scratched into their backs. 3, 5, 7. The same settings seen on the rotor brackets. Caleb noticed another mark. A thin line of yellow paint ran across 2 bolt heads and continued onto the mounting plate. What does that mean? Reference paint. Arthur said, it shows whether the bolt moved, like the red paint on the control box. Arthur nodded. Someone had wanted to know whether vibration changed the settings during operation. They moved to the rear sampling brackets. Arthur made cardboard templates based on the spacing between the mounting pins, from their width and position. He estimated that 3 shallow trays had once collected separate streams of material, leaving the cleaning system, 1 tray beneath the left side, 1 beneath the center, 1 beneath the right. That arrangement would allow engineers to compare grain loss across the machine, not just calculate a single total. Caleb looked beneath the cleaning shoe. There are scratches above each bracket. Arthur ran his finger across them. The marks were narrow and parallel. Metal trays had been inserted and removed repeatedly. Near the center bracket, he found a faint stamped letter, B. The other brackets carried A and C, 3 collection zones, 3 sample trays. This was not a mechanic's improvisation. It was a controlled test system. They returned to the cab. The second wiring harness was too damaged to power, but the metal tags offered clues. Arthur traced each wire manually. RF ran toward the rotor housing. CL reached the cleaning shoe. SEP led into the separator section. Loss ended near a mechanical linkage connected to the rear sampling area. Caleb drew a simple diagram on graph paper. 4 measurement points. 4 observed systems. Arthur corrected. The wires did not appear to carry power to motors. They likely connected to gauges, counters, or mechanical sensors. Arthur removed the empty faceplate from the control box. Behind it, faded pencil writing appeared on the inside surface. Caleb aimed the light. The words were difficult to read, but still visible. Run 18 wet wheat. Below that, num, by, se. Arthur compared the notation with their findings. Rotor setting 5. Blade angle 7. Collection tray C. Caleb understood at the same moment. They recorded each test configuration inside the box. Arthur nodded. The machine had been used in repeated field trials, with settings changed between runs and grain loss measured afterward. Near the bottom of the faceplate, another line had been written more heavily than the others. Best flow. Do not change. Arthur read it twice. That sentence mattered. It suggested the testing had produced a successful configuration. The project had not simply ended in failure. Someone had found a setting worth protecting. Caleb looked toward the rusted machine. If this worked, why was it abandoned? Arthur replaced the faceplate without cleaning the pencil marks. That is the right question. He opened the repair ledger and wrote one conclusion beneath the day's measurements. R12 was designed for controlled field experimentation. Final successful settings may have been identified. Then he added a second line. Do not restore until history is known. Outside, the wind moved through the empty cornfield behind the barn. Inside, the combine remained silent, but the marks left by its engineers were beginning to speak. Arthur spent the next 3 days searching for R12. He began with old service manuals. Every shelf in the back room of his barn held binders collected from repair shops, dealership auctions, and retiring mechanics. Some pages were stained with oil. Others carried handwritten corrections from men who had worked on the machines when they were new. Arthur checked rotor diagrams, gearbox layouts, and electrical schematics from every John Deere combine built within 10 years of the machine's estimated age. Nothing matched. The production models used fixed rotor components. None showed adjustable blade angles. None had 3 sampling brackets beneath the cleaning shoe. None used the unidentified gearbox mounted on R12. Caleb searched online databases and collector forums. He uploaded close photographs of the gearbox, but not the full machine. Arthur did not want attention before they understood what they had. Most replies were guesses. A homemade conversion, a university research machine, a failed aftermarket kit. One retired mechanic named Frank Sutter gave a different answer. He had worked at a John Deere dealership in Iowa during the early 1970s. He remembered company engineers bringing unusual combines through the region during harvest season. The machines arrived without advertising decals. They traveled with service trucks. Dealers were told not to photograph them. Frank remembered one test unit with a modified separator and removable trays beneath the rear section. He had never heard the code R12, but he remembered a project nickname, Responsive Flow. Caleb read the message aloud. Arthur looked toward the combine. RF. The letters matched one of the metal tags inside the hidden wiring harness. Frank provided the name of a former field representative who might know more, but the man had died years earlier. That trail ended quickly. Caleb suggested contacting John Deere directly. Arthur hesitated. Large companies did not always respond well when old machines appeared with claims attached to them. If R12 had been an abandoned experiment, the company might dismiss it before anyone examined the evidence. Still, they needed records. Caleb prepared a short report. It included photographs of the safety-wired gearbox, adjustable rotor brackets, numbered sample mounts, hidden control box, and the Rudodishi stamp. He avoided speculation. The final question was simple. Can John Deere identify this machine or confirm whether R12 was an internal engineering designation? The reply came 2 days later. It was polite and brief. The company representative thanked them for the images but stated that no production records matched the configuration shown. The message continued. John Deere has no documented combine model or approved field modification identified as R12. The components may represent a private or dealer-built alteration. Caleb read the message twice. That's it? Arthur took the printed reply and placed it on the workbench. They searched production records. You think they searched the wrong records? I think we asked about a machine that may never have been intended for production. Caleb looked frustrated. They're saying it doesn't exist. No. Arthur tapped the sentence. They're saying they have no approved model with that name. He returned to the left side of the combine. Near the modified gearbox, years of dirt covered the inside surface of a narrow support brace. Arthur had avoided cleaning it because the area was difficult to reach. Now he used a soft brush and wooden pick. A rectangular patch of darker paint appeared. Something had once been attached there. A plate. Perhaps. The mounting holes remained. But the plate was gone. Below them, faint letters had been scratched directly into the metal. Arthur adjusted the work light. Caleb leaned closer. The inscription read, Test Unit. Return to engineering. Beneath it was a smaller number. 72到184. Caleb immediately searched the number. Nothing appeared online. Arthur copied it into his ledger. Then he examined the missing plate location. The screws had not rusted away. They had been deliberately removed. Someone took the identification plate. Caleb said, Yes. To hide what it was? Maybe to protect it. Arthur studied the empty holes. If the machine had been modified privately, there would have been no reason to mark it for return to engineering. The company's reply had not weakened the case. It had sharpened it. R12 was not in the production records because it had never been a production machine. Caleb looked back at the email. What do we do now? Arthur wrote one name at the top of a clean page. Benson Farm. That was where Mason said the combine had come from. We stop asking what John Deere remembers. He closed the ledger and find out who kept the machine after John Deere forgot it. Benson Farm had been sold twice since the combine stopped working. Arthur found the current owner through county tax records, but the man knew nothing about the machine. He had purchased the land without the old equipment sheds and suggested Arthur contact the previous family. That led to a name, Samuel Benson. Samuel was 86 and lived in a small assisted living home 40 miles away. His memory came and went, according to his daughter, but he still remembered harvest machinery clearly. Arthur and Caleb visited on a cold Thursday morning. Samuel sat near a window with a blanket across his knees. On the table beside him rested a photograph album filled with tractors, threshers, and family harvest scenes. Arthur showed him a picture of the broken combine. Samuel stared at it for almost a minute. That machine should have gone back, he said. Caleb leaned forward. Back where? Samuel looked toward the hallway, as if expecting someone to overhear. To Deere. Arthur placed a photograph of the R12 stamp beside the first image. Do you remember that marking? Samuel nodded slowly. They called it the 12. Who brought it to the farm? A man named Ward. John Deere? Samuel rubbed his thumb against the edge of the photograph. He worked for them. Engineer. Quiet fellow. Arthur opened his ledger. Do you remember his first name? Samuel. Caleb glanced at Arthur. The same first name as Benson. Samuel Benson smiled faintly. We used to joke that one Samuel grew wheat and the other broke machines. He explained that Samuel Ward arrived during the summer of 1972 with 2 company technicians and a service truck. The combine had no model decals. Several panels were covered with canvas whenever it was parked near the road. They tested it in wheat fields for nearly 3 weeks. The engineers changed internal settings after almost every pass. Workers placed shallow metal trays beneath the rear of the combine and weighed what fell into them. That matched Arthur's findings exactly. Did the machine work? Arthur asked. Samuel Benson's expression sharpened. Better than ours. In what way? Wet crop. That season, heavy rain had delayed harvest. Standard combines pushed damp straw through unevenly. They clogged, lost grain, and required frequent stops. R12 behaved differently. Ward adjusted the machine so the crop moved through in a steady layer. Benson remembered watching grain loss decrease from one test run to the next. On the final afternoon, Ward climbed down from the cab holding a clipboard. He was smiling. Benson said, First time I ever saw him smile. What happened after the test? They left the combine. For repairs? Samuel shook his head. A truck was supposed to collect it. The truck never came. Months passed. Then a company representative visited and removed several documents. The main identification plate and 2 instruments from the cab. He said the project had ended. Benson recalled. Did he say why? Too complicated. Too expensive. Something about dealers not being able to service it. Arthur looked at Caleb. The project had not necessarily failed. It may have become impractical to sell. Why didn't Deere take the machine? Caleb asked. Samuel gave a tired shrug. They said another truck would come. No truck ever did. The combine remained on the farm. Benson used it once for parts. But the unusual gearbox did not fit any other machine. Eventually, he pushed it behind a shed and forgot about it. Before Arthur left, Samuel's daughter brought out a cardboard box from a closet. "My father kept old farm photographs," she said. "Maybe there's something useful." They found the image near the bottom. It showed a much younger Samuel Benson standing beside three men in work clothes. Behind them was the same combine, clean and nearly new. The modified gearbox was visible, so were the sampling trays. One of the men held a clipboard against his chest. On the back, written in faded blue ink, were 6 words: Samuel Ward R12 Field Test. Etienne Jobai Tishar. Below that was an address in Waterloo, Iowa. The house had belonged to Ward. Caleb searched the name from his phone. Samuel Ward had died 11 years earlier, but public records listed one surviving daughter, Helen Ward. Arthur placed the photograph in a protective sleeve. The company had no production record for R12, but production records were no longer what they needed. They now had a place, a date, a witness, and the name of the engineer who had stood beside the machine when it still worked. As they prepared to leave, Samuel Benson caught Arthur's sleeve. "Ward believed that machine mattered," he said. Arthur looked back at him. "How do you know?" "Because when the company stopped calling, he came back alone." "For what?" Samuel pointed toward the photograph. "To hide the papers they didn't take." Helen Ward agreed to meet them at her father's old house. The garage had remained almost untouched since Samuel Ward's death. Metal cabinets lined the walls. Rolled drawings stood in a wooden rack. On one bench sat several mechanical gauges wrapped in newspaper. Helen placed the 1972 photograph beneath a lamp. "That is my father," she said, pointing to the man with the clipboard. Arthur showed her the R12 stamp, the adjustable rotor, and the hidden control box. Helen studied the images carefully. "He never called it R12 at home," she said. "He called it the flow machine." She opened a cabinet and removed 3 notebooks. Most pages contained calculations Arthur could not immediately interpret, but several headings were clear: rotor loading, wet wheat trials, separation loss, field unit 12. Caleb photographed each page. One note had been underlined twice: final arrangement stable. Do not permit production simplification before verification. Another entry, written several weeks later, was less controlled. Project stopped. Unit order dismantled. Test results remain valid. Helen explained that her father had grown bitter after the project ended. He believed management had treated an economic decision as an engineering failure. "Did he hide records inside the combine?" Arthur asked. Helen looked surprised. "He said he left the proof where nobody would think to search." That was enough. They returned to the barn that evening. Caleb wanted to expose every possible compartment before daylight faded. He connected a pressure washer and began cleaning the rear body panels. Arthur was inside the cab when he heard the spray strike metal. He climbed down immediately. "Stop." Caleb released the trigger. Water ran across the side of the combine, carrying dirt and flakes of old paint onto the floor. "I was only clearing the seams." Arthur moved closer. Near the rear access panel, several faded inspection marks had almost disappeared beneath the high-pressure stream. One red line was gone completely. Caleb stared at the bare patch. "I didn't know it would lift that fast." Arthur did not answer. He examined the runoff on the floor. Tiny fragments of yellow and red paint floated in the water. Those marks might have identified test settings. Inspection point. R panel position. They could not be replaced. For the first time since buying the combine, Arthur felt they had damaged something more important than a machine. Caleb shut off the washer. "I'm sorry." Arthur remained silent for several seconds. Then he said, "Get every photograph we took of this section." They compared the earlier images with the cleaned panel. 2 red marks and 1 handwritten number had been visible before washing. The number appeared to be 18. Caleb enlarged the image. "That matches the note inside the control box. Run 18. Arthur nodded. The lost paint had been evidence connecting the exterior panel to a recorded test. Fortunately, they had photographed it first. But the mistake changed everything. Arthur removed the pressure washer from the barn. He replaced wire brushes with soft nylon tools. Water would be used only in controlled amounts. No paint, grease, or rust would be removed until its position had been documented. Caleb created a digital record for every section of the machine. Each file included original condition, exact location, measurements, paint marks, stamps, fastenatrup, visible modification. They were no longer preparing the combine for repair. They were preserving a historical object. Near midnight, Arthur returned to the rear panel Caleb had cleaned. With a flashlight held at a low angle, he noticed a narrow welded seam behind the grain tank support. It did not match the factory construction. The weld was too recent compared with the surrounding frame, yet still decades old. He tapped the metal. The sound was hollow. Caleb brought a magnet and moved it across the surface. The panel concealed a rectangular space roughly 18 inches wide and 10 inches high. There were no hinges, no screws. It had been welded shut. Arthur compared its location with the cab, the control box, and Samuel Ward's notebook. Ward had said the proof would remain where nobody would search. A farmer might inspect the engine. A mechanic might open the gearbox. A salvage dealer might strip away valuable parts, but almost no one would cut into a sealed structural panel behind the grain tank. Caleb reached for an angle grinder. Arthur stopped him. Not tonight. We know something is inside. No. We know there is a space. Arthur marked the seam with removable tape and photographed it from every angle. After nearly erasing one piece of evidence, he would not risk another. Before leaving the barn, he wrote a new rule across the top of the ledger. The machine must be understood before it is opened. R12 had survived 50 years of abandonment. Now the greatest danger to its history was no longer rust. It was the people trying too quickly to save it. Arthur did not cut open the hidden compartment the next morning. Instead, he called a retired agricultural engineer named Frank Sutter, the same man who had remembered the responsive flow tests. Arthur sent him photographs of the welded panel, the control box, and Samuel Ward's notebook entries. Frank replied within an hour, "Do not open it with heat." The warning was specific. A grinder or torch could damage paper, film, paint markings, or chemical labels inside. If the compartment contained records, heat and sparks might destroy the evidence before they saw it. Frank recommended drilling 2 small inspection holes along the upper seam and using a flexible camera. Caleb borrowed a borescope from work. Before drilling, Arthur measured the panel and compared it with the combine's original frame drawings. The compartment had been added after production. It did not support the grain tank or any moving assembly. That meant 2 small holes would not weaken the machine. Arthur selected a location where the weld had already cracked. He drilled slowly. The bit passed through steel, then entered empty space. Caleb inserted the camera. At first, the screen showed only darkness and rust. Then the lens turned downward. A rectangular metal box appeared inside the compartment. It was wrapped in thick waxed cloth. Beside it lay a flat aluminum plate. Caleb adjusted the light. Stamped into the plate were the words, Field Engineering Unit. Below that was a serial number. 12 Arthur opened his ledger and compared it with the number scratched near the missing identification plate. They matched. "This is the original identity plate," Caleb said. Arthur nodded. Samuel Ward had not destroyed it. He had hidden it. Now they had proof that R12 was not a nickname added by a farmer. It was an official engineering designation linked to the machine itself. Arthur photographed the borescope screen before withdrawing the camera. Only then did he contact John Deere again. This time, the message did not ask whether the machine existed. Arthur sent the hidden plate, the 1972 field photograph, Samuel Ward's notebook entries, and Benson's witness statement. He ended with one sentence. "The serial number attached to the machine is R1272184. Please search engineering disposal records, not production records." The answer arrived the following afternoon. Thomas Green called personally. His voice was controlled, but no longer dismissive. "Mr. Reed, where did you obtain that number?" "From the machine." "Is the plate removable?" "Not without opening a welded compartment." "Do not remove it." "We haven't." Thomas paused. Our archive contains one reference to that sequence. Caleb activated the phone speaker. What does it say? Arthur asked. Thomas hesitated. It identifies a field evaluation unit assigned to an experimental separator program in 1972. AR-12. The project name is not included in the digital record. Was the machine returned? Another pause. The record states that it was. Arthur looked at the combine. That cannot be correct. Thomas continued. The unit was scheduled for dismantling in March 1973. Scheduled or completed. I am still reviewing that. Arthur heard papers moving on the other end. There is a disposal entry. Thomas said, but the supporting certificate is missing. Caleb leaned closer to the phone. So Deere recorded this machine as destroyed? Yes. And now it is standing in our barn. Thomas did not answer immediately. When he spoke again, his tone had changed. We need to inspect it. Arthur looked toward the sealed compartment. You can inspect the machine, but nothing gets removed without documentation. That is reasonable, and Samuel Ward's family must be informed. Thomas agreed. A team would arrive in 5 days. After the call ended, Caleb stared at the serial number on the camera image. That should be enough to prove it. No. Arthur said, it proves what the machine was called. He pointed toward the waxed package still hidden behind the steel. The real question is what happened during the tests. They spent the next 2 days preparing the barn. Arthur marked every access point and covered fragile paint with protective film. Caleb organized the photographs by date and machine section. Helen brought Samuel Ward's original notebooks and signed a temporary documentation agreement. On the evening before the engineers arrived, Arthur stood alone beside R-12. For weeks, the combine had been treated as a private repair project. That was over. John Deere now knew the machine existed, and somewhere in its archives was a record claiming it had been destroyed more than 50 years earlier. Arthur rested one hand on the sealed panel. The prototype was no longer just lost. Officially, it was impossible. By noon the next day, 3 black vehicles turned into the driveway. The first engineer stepped out carrying an archival case. The second carried inspection equipment. Thomas Green approached the barn without looking at the house. His eyes remained fixed on the combine. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he noticed the modified gearbox. The color left his face. That housing, he said quietly, only appears in one surviving drawing. Thomas Green stopped beside the left side of the combine. He did not touch the gearbox. Instead, he opened the archival case and removed a printed engineering drawing sealed in clear plastic. Arthur immediately recognized the outline. The housing shape matched. The mounting angle matched. Even the 2 reinforced braces matched the drawing. Thomas placed the sheet beside the real assembly. At the top, a faded title read, Responsive Flow Separator Field Configuration B. Caleb looked from the drawing to the gearbox. So R-12 was part of responsive flow. Thomas nodded. The project existed. Very few records survived. One of the engineers, Laura Kim, began photographing the machine with a measurement scale beside every component. Another engineer used a portable scanner to record the rotor housing and adjustment slots. Arthur remained close. Nothing was removed. Nothing was cleaned. Every action was documented. Laura examined the safety-wired bolts. These were installed by the Waterloo Experimental Shop. She said, "How can you tell?" Caleb asked. "The wire pattern." She pointed to the final twist near the bolt head. The engineering shop used 7 turns per inch and bent the tail inward. Production service departments used a different method. It was a small detail, but it connected the machine directly to the company's test division. At the rear, the engineers inspected the 3 sampling brackets. Thomas compared their dimensions with another drawing. The document showed removable trays labeled A left discharge, B, center discharge, C, right discharge. Arthur had identified them correctly. Laura moved into the cab and photographed the hidden control box. The handwritten note inside the faceplate drew her attention. Run, 18 wet wheat. She checked a photocopied test index. There was a run 18, she said. Thomas looked up sharply. You found it? Only the reference line. The actual report is missing. The index listed the date, crop condition, and operator initials. The initials were S. W. Samuel Ward. The team then turned to the serial number hidden behind the welded panel. Arthur inserted the borescope himself while they watched the screen. The aluminum identification plate appeared clearly. 12 Offius. Thomas photographed it from several angles. Then he opened a digital copy of the disposal register. The same number appeared beside a typed entry, returned from field evaluation. Approved for dismantling. Below it should have been the certificate confirming destruction. The space was blank. No date. No employee signature. No salvage weight. Thomas studied the record for a long time. Every dismantled engineering unit required 3 confirmations. He said, "This has none, so it was never destroyed." Caleb said, "It was recorded as returned." Thomas replied, "That may have been enough for someone to close the file." Arthur looked toward the missing exterior plate. Someone removed the identity and left the machine behind. Thomas did not disagree. The engineers continued for 4 hours. They measured the adjustable rotor positions, blow angles, reinforced housing, sensor mounts, and modified cleaning shoe. Each feature matched fragments of surviving project drawings. The most important confirmation came from inside the gearbox. Arthur allowed them to remove one small inspection cover after every bolt had been photographed and marked. Laura inserted a camera through the opening. The screen showed a sliding internal collar connected to a secondary control shaft. Thomas leaned closer. That is the variable flow mechanism. The collar allowed the machine to change how quickly crop material moved through the separator. In heavy, wet wheat, the operator could slow the material briefly, spread it more evenly, then increase the flow again. Modern combines used sensors and electronic controls to make similar adjustments. R12 had attempted it mechanically more than 50 years earlier. Laura pointed to a stamped mark on the collar. Expequate. She checked the drawing set. The number matched a prototype component listed as manufactured in a quantity of 1. That ended the argument. R12 was not a dealer modification. It was not a university experiment. It was a genuine John Deere engineering prototype. Thomas stepped away from the machine and removed his glasses. "We can confirm the field unit is authentic." Helen, who had remained near the workbench, asked the question Arthur had been waiting to hear. "Was my father's design successful?" Thomas looked toward the sealed compartment. "We know the mechanism existed. That isn't what I asked." He paused. "The surviving archive is incomplete. We have no final performance report." Arthur pointed toward the hidden waxed package. "Then the report may still be inside." Thomas examined the welded seam. Opening it would require a preservation specialist, controlled tools, and written custody procedures. He agreed to return the next morning with the proper equipment. Before leaving, he stood beside Arthur. "There is something else." "What?" "Our archive lists 3 responsive flow field units." Arthur looked at R12. "Where are the other 2? One was dismantled in 1970. One. And the third?" Thomas closed the file. "It disappeared from the record 6 months before this machine was sent to Benson Farm." Caleb glanced at the prototype. "So this may not be the only survivor." Thomas shook his head. "No." He looked again at the unique EXP4 component. "But based on the configuration we inspected today, it may be the only unit that reached the final design stage." The machine was authentic. The engineering was real, but the most important evidence remained sealed behind steel, and by the next morning, they would finally learn why Samuel Ward had hidden it. The preservation specialist arrived at 8 the next morning. Her name was Dr. W. Elaine Foster, and she treated the welded compartment as if it contained evidence from a crime scene. Before touching the machine, she photographed the panel, measured the weld, recorded the surrounding paint, and placed protective blankets over the gearbox and cab floor. "No heat," she said. Arthur nodded. Elaine used a fine pneumatic saw to cut through only the outer weld bead. The blade moved slowly, producing almost no sparks. After 40 minutes, the panel loosened. Arthur and Caleb watched from behind the marked boundary line. Elaine lifted the steel cover with gloved hands. Inside sat the waxed package and the aluminum identification plate they had seen through the camera. The cloth was dry but brittle. Elaine placed the package inside a clean archival tray before opening it. The first layer contained field photographs. R12 appeared in wheat, parked beside a service truck. In several images, Samuel Ward stood near the rear sampling trays, while technicians weighed grain and chaff on a portable scale. Beneath the photographs were handwritten test sheets. Each page listed crop moisture, ground speed, rotor position, blade angle, grain loss, fuel use, plugging events. Arthur recognized the combinations written inside the control box. Run 18 used rotor position 5, blade angle 7, and tray C. The result column had been circled. Lowest measured loss under wet load conditions. Helen pressed one hand against the workbench. My father was right. Thomas said nothing. Elaine removed another folder. Its cover read, Responsive Flow Separator Final Field Evaluation. The report was dated October 4. Samuel Ward's name appeared as lead field engineer. Thomas read the summary aloud. The prototype had reduced separator loss in wet wheat by nearly a third, compared with the production control machine used during the same tests. It had also maintained more consistent crop flow and required fewer shutdowns to clear blockages. Caleb looked toward R12. So it worked. Laura Kim continued reading. The system had weaknesses. The variable mechanism required precise adjustment. The experimental gearbox added weight. Several internal components showed accelerated wear. The machine would have been difficult for ordinary dealerships to service without special training. But none of those problems invalidated the design. The final recommendation was clear. Proceed to advanced development with simplified controls and revised service access. Thomas turned the page. A typed management note had been attached later. It stated that the program would be discontinued because of projected manufacturing cost, dealer readiness, and uncertain demand. The wording never called the machine a failure. That description appeared only in a later archive summary. Arthur looked at Thomas. Somebody changed the meaning. Thomas examined the attached note. Not the original decision. The later record. How? When projects are condensed into archive indexes, complicated outcomes become short labels. Caleb pointed toward the digital disposal entry. Then unsuccessful project was easier than explaining all this. Thomas nodded reluctantly. Helen found one final sheet beneath the report. It was handwritten by Samuel Ward. The ink had faded, but the message remained readable. If the unit is dismantled, preserve the final configuration. The result must not be separated from the machine that produced it. Below the note, Ward had drawn the location of the hidden compartment. He had returned to Benson Farm after the project ended. He removed the identity plate, sealed the test records inside the combine, and protected the final configuration from being stripped for parts. He had not stolen the machine. He had preserved the proof. Thomas stepped away from the workbench and called the company archive director. The conversation lasted nearly 20 minutes. When he returned, his tone was formal. John Deere now recognizes R12 as an authentic, responsive flow field prototype. Helen waited. And my father's results? The final report will be added to the corrected historical record. Arthur looked toward the machine. That still does not answer whether this is the last one. Laura opened another document recovered from the package. It listed all 3 field units. R10 had been dismantled after an early gearbox failure. R11 had been stripped for components and returned to the engineering shop. R12 alone carried the final EXP4 mechanism. Beside its serial number, Samuel Ward had written, "Only complete final configuration unit." The barn became silent. For weeks, Arthur had been trying to prove that the machine was more than scrap. Now the evidence had gone further. R12 was not merely a lost prototype. It was the only surviving machine that showed the project in its successful final form. Thomas closed the report. The company will need to discuss acquisition. Arthur looked at him. You mean buying it back? Yes. And the records? Those as well. Arthur glanced at Helen. Then at the sealed compartment that had protected the truth for half a century. The machine is not for sale separately from its history. Thomas nodded. I expected you would say that. By afternoon, the official inspection ended. But before leaving, Thomas placed one document on Arthur's workbench. It was a preliminary valuation request. No amount had been written yet. Only one classification appeared at the top: Unique Historical Engineering Asset. 3 days after the inspection, Arthur's barn was quieter than it had been in weeks. The engineers had left. The cameras were gone. The sealed reports had been transferred into archival cases, yet the combine stood exactly where it had for the past month, still wearing faded green paint, cracked glass, and rust that no one dared remove. The only difference was that everyone now knew what it really was. Caleb was organizing copies of the recovered documents when a black SUV pulled into the driveway. Thomas Green stepped out, carrying a leather portfolio instead of an engineering case. Arthur knew immediately this visit was different. "This isn't another inspection," he said. Thomas smiled. "No, it's about ownership." Thomas nodded. Inside the barn, Helen Ward joined them beside the workbench, where Samuel Ward's notebooks were neatly arranged. Thomas opened the portfolio and removed several typed documents. The Historical Preservation Committee met yesterday. Arthur remained silent. They unanimously agreed that R12 should become part of John Deere's permanent engineering collection. Caleb looked toward the combine. "So this is the offer." Thomas slid the first page across the table. Arthur read the number. "Samba Arshawumeyuan." Ling ling ling. For several seconds, no one spoke. Only a month earlier, the machine had sold at auction for $40. Now the company that once forgot it was offering more than most farms in the county were worth. Caleb quietly let out a breath. Helen never looked at the number. Instead, she continued reading the remaining pages. Arthur did the same. The purchase agreement included transportation, preservation, digital archiving, and ownership transfer, but he ignored the financial terms. Instead, he searched for one section: historical recognition. He found it halfway through the contract. The wording read, "Engineering contributions associated with the Responsive Flow Separator program will be acknowledged where appropriate." Arthur looked up. "Where appropriate?" Thomas understood immediately. The legal department wrote that it doesn't say Samuel Ward. It refers to the engineering team. Arthur closed the folder. "No." Thomas wasn't surprised. "What would you like it to say?" Arthur reached beneath the workbench and removed a folded sheet of paper. He had written it the night before, not because he expected the company to make an offer, because he expected lawyers to reduce history into careful language. Thomas unfolded the page. Arthur had listed 5 conditions. First, Samuel Ward must be publicly identified as lead field engineer for R12. Second, the Benson farm must be recognized as the final field testing location. Third, the recovered notebooks, photographs, and reports must be digitally preserved without alteration. Fourth, researchers must be allowed to study the complete archive. Finally, the combine itself could never be cosmetically restored in a way that erased evidence of testing. Thomas stopped reading. "The last condition is unusual." Arthur looked toward R12. "It isn't a restored tractor." "No, it isn't showroom equipment." Thomas nodded. "The scratches matter. The worn adjustment slots matter. The paint marks matter." Arthur rested one hand on the machine. "They're part of the experiment." Helen spoke for the first time. "My father spent years proving this design worked." She looked directly at Thomas. "I won't watch someone polish away the proof." Thomas quietly closed the folder. "I understand." "Do you?" He hesitated. "When I first received your email," he admitted, "I assumed this would be another collector claiming to own something rare." Arthur smiled faintly. So did everyone else. Thomas looked around the barn. "But collectors usually restore machines. You preserved one." There was a difference. Collectors chased appearance. Arthur had protected evidence. That realization had changed how John Deere viewed the combine. It was no longer simply valuable because it was rare. It was valuable because its history remained intact. Thomas stood and walked slowly around the machine one final time. His hand hovered above the modified gearbox but never touched it. "When I joined Deere," he said quietly, "I was taught that responsive flow failed." Helen looked at him. "What do you believe now?" Thomas answered without hesitation. "I believe history became shorter than the truth." Silence filled the barn. Outside, the afternoon wind moved through the dry corn stalks. Finally, Thomas reopened the contract. I cannot approve these changes myself. Arthur nodded. I didn't expect you to. But I'll recommend every one of them. Caleb looked surprised. You think they'll agree? Thomas smiled. They've already changed their opinion once. Arthur folded the unsigned contract and handed it back. So my answer is no. Thomas accepted it calmly. I assumed it would be. You drove all this way expecting a rejection? I drove here expecting negotiation. Before leaving, Thomas stopped beside the barn door. There is one thing you should know. Arthur waited. The committee didn't argue about the price. What did they argue about? Thomas looked back at R12. They argued whether this is the most important surviving engineering prototype the company has ever recovered. After he left, Caleb stood staring down the empty driveway. You turned down $325,000. Arthur continued placing Samuel Ward's photographs into protective sleeves. I turned down an incomplete agreement. Most people would have signed. Arthur carefully sealed another photograph. Most people weren't trying to protect someone else's life's work. Helen smiled for the first time that afternoon. My father would have liked you. Arthur looked once more at the combine. Weeks earlier, everyone had laughed at an old mechanic, buying worthless scrap. Now one of the largest agricultural equipment companies in the world had walked away without it. Not because they lacked the money, but because Arthur Reed believed history was worth more than a signature on the first contract. Somewhere inside John Deere headquarters, the committee would meet again. This time, they wouldn't be deciding how much R12 was worth. They would be deciding how much the truth was worth. Mason Pike learned about the offer before Arthur told anyone. By the following morning, half the county already knew John Deere had offered more than $300,000 for the combine sitting in Arthur Reed's barn. The number changed slightly each time the story was repeated. Some said 300,000. Others said $500,000. One man at the feed store claimed the machine had contained gold-plated parts, but every version ended the same way. Arthur had bought it from Mason's auction for $40. At 10 o'clock, Mason's truck turned into the driveway. He parked near the barn and stepped out holding a folded auction document. Arthur was inside, recording the condition of the recovered aluminum identification plate. Caleb saw Mason first. He doesn't look friendly. Arthur continued writing. He rarely does. Mason entered the barn without greeting either of them. His eyes moved directly to R12. The machine no longer looked different from the day of the auction. Its paint was still faded. The unloading auger still rested at an unnatural angle. Rust still covered the header and lower panels. But Mason looked at it as though the machine had changed behind his back. You got an offer from Deere, he said. Arthur set down his pen. Yes. How much? That's private. 325,000? Arthur did not answer. Mason unfolded the auction sheet and slapped it onto the workbench. That machine came through my yard. It did. I arranged the sale. You did. I should have been told what it was worth. Arthur looked at him calmly. No one knew what it was worth. You knew enough to buy it. I knew enough to look closer. Mason pointed at the R12 stamp. You saw that before the bidding? Yes. And you covered it? Arthur remembered wiping away the grease and placing his hand over the small marking. I covered something I didn't understand. That gave you an advantage. Looking at the machine gave me an advantage. Mason's face tightened. The auction description called it non-running equipment. That was accurate. It should have been listed as a prototype. No one knew it was one. Mason stepped closer. You're saying the Benson family didn't know? They knew engineers had tested it. They did not know the records were hidden inside. And you expect me to believe you discovered everything after paying $40? Arthur turned the auction document toward him. The listing described the combine as non-running. Engine seized. Condition unknown. Sold as is. There was no guarantee that all parts were original. There was no claim that the machine had been fully inspected. There was no restriction preventing a buyer from researching it later. You sold exactly what you described. Arthur said, a broken combine of unknown condition. Mason stared at the paper. It wasn't unknown to you. It was. You suspected something. Yes. That should count. Arthur folded his arms. Every buyer standing there could see the gearbox. No one knew it mattered. I didn't know either. You still bid? Because it was unusual. Mason looked toward Caleb, perhaps expecting support. Caleb remained silent. Mason walked around the combine. For once, he examined it instead of simply looking at its size. He stopped at the modified gearbox. Arthur had placed small numbered markers beside the safety-wired bolts, reinforced braces, and hand-stamped code. Mason touched one of the braces. "What did you see here?" Arthur joined him. The housing had no production number. That happens with replacement parts. The mounting points were engineered before installation. How can you tell? The braces were cut to exact angles. The frame was reinforced symmetrically. The fasteners were wired for inspection. Mason leaned closer to the bolts. "I thought someone used whatever parts they had." "That is what most people thought." "What made you think differently?" Arthur pointed to the twisted stainless wire. "A farmer repairs a machine so the bolt stays tight." He then pointed to the small reference paint on a nearby fitting. "An engineer marks it so he can prove whether it moved." Mason said nothing. Arthur showed him the adjustable rotor brackets, engraved settings, sampling tray mounts, and hidden control box. Every clue had been visible at the auction. Not all were easy to understand, but none had appeared after Arthur purchased the machine. Mason crouched near one of the sampling brackets. "And these?" They held trays. "For catching grain? For measuring loss across 3 discharge zones?" Mason stood slowly. "You knew all that in the yard?" "No." "Then you were lucky?" Arthur nodded. "Yes." The simple agreement seemed to surprise him. Mason waited for an argument. But Arthur continued. "I was lucky Samuel Benson remembered the tests. Lucky Samuel Ward kept notebooks. Lucky the hidden compartment stayed dry. Lucky Caleb photographed the paint before we damaged part of it." Caleb glanced at the cleaned rear panel. Arthur had not tried to hide their mistake, but luck did not compare serial numbers. Arthur said, "It did not stop us from cutting the compartment open with a torch. It did not make us document every fastener." Mason looked at R12 again. His anger had started to lose shape. Beneath it was something more difficult to admit. Regret. He had spent 30 years buying machines according to weight. A tractor became cast iron, copper, rubber, and labor. A combine became several tons of steel minus transport costs. Most of the time, that method worked. Dead machinery rarely carried hidden engineering reports. But R12 had exposed the weakness in his way of seeing. He had measured everything except meaning. "You're not selling it?" Mason asked. "Not under the first agreement? You turned them down?" "Yes." "For how much?" Arthur looked at him. "Enough that most people would have signed." Mason gave a bitter laugh. "You really have lost your mind." "Maybe." "What more do you want?" "Samuel Ward's name on the history." "That's worth risking the money?" "Yes." The company already offered to preserve the machine. Preserving the steel isn't enough. Mason shook his head. "You bought it for $40. Arthur looked toward the sealed archival case containing Ward's final report. "No. I bought the right to investigate it for $40. That sounds like the same thing?" "It isn't." Mason turned away from the machine. For several seconds, only the ticking of the cooling barn heater could be heard. Then he asked quietly, "What happens if they refuse your conditions?" "R12 stays here." "You would walk away from that kind of money?" Arthur nodded. Mason stared at him, as though trying to decide whether this was stubbornness or principle. Before he could speak, a second vehicle entered the driveway. It was Thomas Green. He stepped out carrying a revised contract. Mason recognized him from local news photographs and immediately understood why he was there. Thomas entered the barn, noticed the auctioneer, and paused. Arthur made no introduction. Thomas placed the new folder on the workbench. The committee approved the historical recognition terms. Helen Ward's name appeared on the first page as the legal representative of Samuel Ward's archive. The revised agreement specifically identified Ward as lead field engineer for the R12 final configuration. It named Benson Farm as the test location. It guaranteed preservation of the original paint marks, where patterns, velds, and handwritten notes. It required a complete digital archive and controlled research access, and it stated that any public interpretation of the prototype would distinguish technical performance from the business decision that ended the project. Mason read the page from where he stood. His eyes stopped at the purchase amount. The number had not changed. $325,000. Thomas looked at Arthur. With these revisions, will you accept? Arthur did not answer immediately. He read each line again. Then he handed the contract to Helen. She reviewed the section bearing her father's name. When she finished, she nodded. Arthur signed. Mason watched the pen move across the paper. The combine he had valued as scrap now belonged to John Deere again, but not under the same history that had once erased it. Thomas closed the folder. Transport will be arranged after full preservation mapping. Mason walked toward the barn door. Before leaving, he turned back. I still think I should have gotten something. Arthur looked at him. You did. What? The same opportunity everyone else had. Mason's expression hardened. No, I didn't. Arthur pointed toward the gearbox. You saw it before I did. Mason stood there for a moment, unable to answer. Then he walked outside and drove away. Caleb watched the truck disappear beyond the field. Do you feel bad for him? Arthur looked at R12. A little. Why? Because he'll spend the rest of his life thinking he lost $325,000. Arthur placed Samuel Ward's photograph beside the signed agreement. What he really lost was the habit of asking one more question. The transport team arrived before sunrise. 2 preservation specialists walked around R12 with clipboards, while a heavy recovery truck backed toward the barn. Every contact point had been planned in advance. They would not pull the combine by its damaged axle. They would not attach chains to the modified separator housing. They would not remove the unusual gearbox to reduce weight. Instead, steel supports were placed beneath the frame at the original factory lifting points. Soft straps protected the faded paint, while vibration sensors were attached near the experimental rotor and sealed compartment. Arthur watched from the workbench. When he had brought the machine home, the driver had dragged its locked wheels across a trailer deck. Now a team of experts spent nearly an hour moving it less than 20 feet. Caleb stood beside him. Hard to believe this is the same machine. It is the same machine. Arthur said, people are just looking at it differently. Helen arrived carrying Samuel Ward's original photograph. The image showed her father standing beside R12 inches 1,972. When the paint was clean and the tires were still new, she held it up against the combine. For the first time, the machine in the photograph and the rusted machine in the barn seemed like one continuous object rather than 2 separate versions. Thomas Green approached Arthur with a document folder. The transfer is complete. Arthur accepted his copy. John Deere now legally owned the prototype, but the agreement required the company to preserve the machine in its recovered condition. No repainting could occur without historical review. No experimental component could be replaced simply to make the combine appear operational. The scratches would remain, the adjustment marks would remain, even the section accidentally cleaned by Caleb would be documented as part of the recovery history. What happens first? Caleb asked. Stabilization, Thomas said, then full scanning and material analysis. Will you try to run it? Thomas looked toward Arthur. Arthur answered before he could. No. Caleb appeared surprised. Not even once? The engine is seized. Several bearings are damaged. Starting it would require replacing original parts and disturbing the final test configuration. Thomas nodded. The machine's value is not in whether it can harvest again. Arthur looked at the experimental gearbox. It already proved it could. The recovery truck slowly pulled R12 into daylight. Rust flakes fell from the header. One rear tire sagged under the weight. The broken unloading auger was supported by a temporary frame. Nothing about the combine looked valuable in the ordinary sense. Yet the entire movement stopped when one strap shifted less than an inch. The team repositioned it before continuing. Several neighbors had gathered near the road. Some had attended Mason's auction. Arthur recognized the young farmer who had joked that he had purchased a graveyard. The man now stood behind the fence, filming the transport with his phone. No one laughed. When R12 was secured on the trailer, Helen walked to the left side and placed her hand near the small stamped marking. My father never knew anyone would find it. Arthur stood beside her. He made sure someone could. Thomas asked them to join the transport team for one final photograph. Arthur almost refused. The machine belonged in the picture. He did not feel that he did. But Helen insisted. They stood beneath the faded R12 stamp, While Caleb held Samuel Ward's 1972 photograph in front of him, the camera captured two moments at once: the engineer who had protected the result, and the mechanic who had recognized that the machine still had something to say. The trailer left the farm just after 9. Arthur watched until the top of the combine disappeared beyond the trees. The empty space inside the barn seemed larger than expected. For weeks, R12 had filled the building with questions. Now only the numbered floor marks remained. Caleb broke the silence. "What are you going to do with the money?" Arthur walked toward the old office at the rear of the barn. Its windows were dusty. The workbenches were crowded with broken carburetors, worn bearings, and repair manuals that had not been opened in years. "Reopen the shop." Caleb smiled. "To repair combines? To teach people how to inspect them before they repair them." Arthur planned to use part of the payment to rebuild the workshop. There would be space for mechanical training, historical documentation, and equipment preservation. Young technicians could learn how to identify wear patterns, original fasteners, experimental modifications, and field repairs. Caleb offered to install digital scanning equipment. Helen donated copies of Samuel Ward's notebooks for study. They named the place the Reed Ward Agricultural Mechanics Workshop. 6 months later, John Deere invited them to the public unveiling of R12. The prototype stood in a large exhibition hall beneath controlled lighting. It had not been repainted. The rust remained visible. The cracked windshield had been stabilized but not replaced. The safety wire still held the experimental gearbox bolts exactly as Arthur had found them. A transparent panel allowed visitors to see the hidden compartment and the aluminum identity plate inside. Beside the machine stood a display containing the field report, photographs, and Samuel Ward's handwritten note. The main sign read, R12, Responsive Flow Separator, Final Field Prototype, 1972. Below it appeared the full historical explanation. The system had successfully reduced grain loss in wet wheat. The project had ended because of manufacturing expense, maintenance complexity, and limited commercial readiness. Samuel Ward was identified as lead field engineer. Benson Farm was named as the final test location. Arthur read every line. There was no vague reference to an unnamed project team, no suggestion that the machine had failed, no attempt to simplify the ending. Helen stood in front of her father's name. For several moments, she said nothing. Then she touched the edge of the display case. He spent the rest of his life thinking the work had disappeared. Arthur looked at the visitors gathering around the combine. It didn't disappear. It was hidden. A group of engineering students entered the hall with an instructor. They stopped near the modified gearbox while a museum guide explained the mechanical variable flow mechanism. One student pointed toward the safety wire. "Is that how they knew it was experimental?" The guide smiled. It was one of the first clues. Arthur listened from several feet away. At Mason's auction, that same wire had been covered in grease. Everyone had seen a ruined machine. Arthur had seen a fastener secured in a way that did not belong. That small contradiction had led to the gearbox, the sampling trays, the hidden control box, Samuel Ward, the sealed reports, and the serial number of a machine officially recorded as destroyed. The discovery had not begun with certainty. It had begun with doubt. As Arthur prepared to leave, Thomas handed him a small metal plaque. It was a reproduction of the original identification plate, Field Engineering Unit, 12-184. The original stays with the machine. Thomas said, "We thought this belonged in your workshop." Arthur turned the plaque over. A second inscription had been added to the back, recovered by Arthur Reed and Caleb Reed. Arthur ran his thumb across the letters. He had not rescued the combine alone. Samuel Ward had hidden the evidence. Samuel Benson had remembered the tests. Helen had preserved the notebooks. Caleb had documented the machine and learned from his mistake. Even Mason's careless auction had placed R12 where Arthur could find it. The prototype had survived because several people, separated by decades, had each protected one piece of its story. Before leaving the exhibition hall, Arthur looked back one final time. Visitors surrounded R12. They studied the rust, the unusual welds, and the faded test marks. They read Samuel Ward's name and examined the report, proving that the design had worked. No one called it scrap. But the greatest change was not the sign, the valuation, or the museum lighting. The machine had always been a prototype. Its value had always existed. The world had simply failed to recognize it. Until one old mechanic noticed a part that did not belong and asked the question everyone else had ignored. What if the broken machine was never ordinary in the first place?